Welcome back, champions. Episode 3 of Commander Analysis. Soren's up first this time. So right off the bat, you'll notice he doesn't have a passive increase to troop stats at all. That is a downside, but I believe there's a pretty good reason for that. And that is that he's not designed to buff your troops. His skill's not centered around troops in any way. And it makes him versatile and able to slot into any team without having to consider that. So his rage cost is about 800, which is medium to high, probably better suited to a second slot. Skill damage of 880 coefficient, which is only slightly above average as far as the ratio goes, but he can hit 3 targets at once and most likely will with that area of effect in any major fight. So that means his damage is going to be right up to 2640, which is one of the highest, especially considering it's single hit. So it's not a damage over time effect that can be cleansed. It can be reduced and delayed, obviously, but if it lands, it's going to do that damage. Now the skill increases skill damage by 50% for 7 seconds, which is quite long. And it also applies to any skill damage done to that target by any member of your alliance. So by having a few Sorens in a few different teams, hitting 3 people at once, you can really significantly boost the amount of damage as a whole that you're doing to the enemies, especially for those big team fights where you've got multiple armies, and by multiple I mean quite a lot. It's really going to make a big difference to the damage output overall. And considering that many alliances are going to have members that don't have the stats or that don't have the commander options to field certain teams, they're not going to be your main damage dealers necessarily, but they can definitely support, and Soren's somebody that pretty much everyone should have and should have at a high level. So next up is Shelia. We're on a bit of a bow trend. A couple of my members would love to hear that, as much as I'd hate to admit it. But there is bowmasters out there. I'm not particularly one of them. I don't judge them as particularly useful in normal gameplay, for a reason, I think. I think it's a generally accepted fact. But in this game mode, they've really started to shine a little, and I will admit to training a significant amount of bows since the first match. Now, you're not necessarily going to have the Lord with your bow team. Well, it's probably almost definitely not a good idea to, as you're not going to have a significant amount of bow stats, and their health and defense isn't really important anyway. It's all about the attack. So your Lord's probably better off buffing up troops that are going to be in there having the damage laid on them and laying the damage on others. Whereas the bow team, if it's used effectively by kiting and just generally keeping away from the enemy, you've got 360 movement, you've got dynamic range, you can definitely do it. And if you do, it works pretty well. She's got a rage cost of 650, which is pretty low, and a damage coefficient of 1400, which is middle. But that 1400 also comes from her dot damage. So it needs to be sustained. If it gets cleansed, that's going to drop off a little. As far as troop buffs go, she's pretty good. 150% passive bow attack and then 150% from the skill. I think she's a real cracker, actually, if you're looking to have a bow team, and I don't think it's a bad option to have a bow team. This mode is more dynamic, and this mode does call for a bit more variety. Now this one's a bit of a smoking hot babe. Jean's a little bit of a cheeky favourite of mine for this mode. So rage cost of 800, damage coefficient of 540 isn't really significant. It's sort of mid to low. But what is significant is her skill effect. So 75% chance to inflict fear of war, which renders the target unable to attack or counter for 7 seconds. It's a reasonable amount of time, and as discussed in, say, episode 1, I believe, if the enemy isn't hitting on you, then you don't need to worry about sustain all that much, because there's just no damage to, soak. On top of that, you're not necessarily going to be using Cavs in any way as a tank. If you pinpoint attacking, flanking, pincering, they're not designed or they're not expected to be taking a lot of damage. If you're using their mobility to effect, then it's more about what they can do to the enemy than what the enemy can do to them. It does, however, come with 150% cavalry defense and health increase on top of a cav defense increase of 150%. So it's not a bad way to pick up stats if your lord's not in that particular team. Cav defense, obviously, kind of bleh, but it's there, and it's I'm sure it's got a use. Overall, I just think that skill is really handy. If you couple that with, say, a team of Rob and Russell, then you can really do some, not so much damage necessarily. I mean, it's going to do damage, but you can really disrupt the enemy in the back line and also get some stats into that team, especially if there's no Lord there between the three of them. They're going to make those Cav, at least reasonable stats. A little bit of double down going on in this episode. We got Cav up again, Merrill Peak, 650 rage cost, quite low, 960 damage coefficient, quite high. Also increases attack of your cavalry by 150%. Cannot stack for 4 seconds. Now, the cannot stack confused me a little. It's got a cooldown of 12 seconds and a duration of 4, so you're not going to have a buff for 8 seconds anyway. But the reason for this is that the buff doesn't apply to you, it applies to the enemy. Not in the sense that the enemy gets the additional attack, but in the sense that anybody who attacks that enemy does, which makes a skill like this a lot more useful than I first realised it would be. You're obviously then buffing a lot of people if your alliance is targeting enemies effectively for the pincer damage. So he's also got a cavalry health and cavalry attack for his passive boosts, which are both sought after stats. All round, it's all good. Nothing bad to say about old Merrill. But I've also said that about Gene and, Russell and Rob as well. Especially Russ, he's a pretty good bloke. But that's kind of the point of this series. It's not so much about ranking them comparative to each other. It's about showing that depending on what your team setup is and what you're aiming to achieve, they're all good options in different ways. So across your whole alliance, you really got to talk to people about getting a mix in. If you just focus these SS rank high tier commanders, then you're really doing yourself a disservice, because when they're all combined, they're all going to be really effective in different ways and make your alliance a lot more effective as a whole. Particularly in a game mode that is so centered around some massive battles. So I'm glad I finally got around to talking about that cannot stack. It's been annoying me a little bit. Auslan employs a very similar skill. Really similar. He's basically the spear version of Merrill, who we just looked at. So rage cost of 650, nice and low. Damage coefficient of 700 this time, which is a little lower, but it's due to the fact that he also reduces the target's rage by 80, which isn't the most significant, but it's still a little some, just make him a little bit more interesting, and a little bit more useful, I suppose, in a sense. So also increases attack of your spearmen by 150%. As said, it's pretty much Merrill with a spear and no horse. Phalanx Inspiration, Spear Health, and Spear Attack, 150% for his passives, once again, basically carbon copy. I do think that they are, comparable in a lot of ways, but obviously Spear and Cav have a whole lot of differences. So the Spear does have the mid-range, which is a little bit greater than the Cav, but I wouldn't say that you could then take the same tactic as, say, the bow, where you can really go full attack and just play with that maneuverability. Because they do tend to get amongst it, the spears. They're a little bit further out, but it's not uncommon for people to do mixed teams and to end up with a mid-range attack box. So plenty of people are going to be able to keep you in range, just as you're going to be able to keep them in range. So something to be aware of and to be careful of. If you've got a spear team, try and give them some sustain, maybe an Annie or something, just to, keep them alive. Done and dusted, champs. So that's episode 3. We've got a couple more installments, and we also still have this giveaway going on. Make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next 2 episodes. Comment your name and your kingdom number below each of the 5 episodes, and you go into the running for a gift code just for you. And cheers for watching. Latest, champs.